Thank you to both Andrew as well as Matt for inviting me to say a few words in respect of the questions surrounding the use of the Emergency Management Act, as well as the opportunity to continue to issue directions which have ever more increasing impacts on each one of our lives. Allow me firstly to say that the Emergency Management Act was only ever intended to provide for real emergencies. Those are conditions that were in place for a very short period of time, enabling the executive arm of government to entirely bypass the arm of government which makes the laws, the Parliament. And the obvious reason for this is that in the state of an emergency, for a limited period of time, the requirement is for the executive to take extraordinary measures in order to deal with an emergency. That could be a flood, it could be a bushfire, it could be a tsunami, a range of natural type disasters. Now, the Emergency Management Act is now being extended to include the provision for and dealing with the COVID-19 situation that has enveloped the world. The Parliament has had more than sufficient time to pass specific legislation aimed at ensuring that the Parliament reviews whether or not people ought to be the subject of very strict management requirements. However, despite a significant period of time, that has not been the preferred approach of governments, but rather the preferred approach is to allow the executive arm of government, through the Commissioner of Police, to pass directions to direct people to do certain things, and enabling not only police officers but also authorised persons or persons now known as marshals to police the requirements of those directions. Now, this is a particularly troubling aspect of what we can see when government allows the executive arm of government to have powers which probably extend arguably beyond the requirement to reduce the loss of life. The Emergency Management Act expressly states that a state of emergency can be declared to ensure that there would be a reduction in the loss of life, or to deal with matters of a scale and impact that would result in a loss of life. Now, some of you no doubt are troubled by a requirement by government to now collect information and statistics in your businesses which are prescribed for under the provisions of the directions, which require you to check whether or not people have had the relevant vaccinations. And although businesses have complied willingly with the requirements of masks, requirements in respect of scanning people into their business or requiring them to keep a register, and businesses generally have seen that this makes particularly good sense, they are now saying that perhaps it's a step too far to require businesses to police whether or not, on the basis of somebody's medical records, which incidentally ordinarily and usually are kept private, ought to be checking whether or not a person who is a customer or patron of the business ought properly to have been vaccinated prior to their entry. I feel that there's a very real sense amongst many Australians that this is a step too far. The Australian community has been compliant, they've been assisting government, and they have ensured that government is able to fight the COVID pandemic by taking up vaccinations at rates within this country unseen in most countries. For example, in Italy, there's only about a 78% double vaccination rate, whereas in Western Australia, we're moving very close, if not exceeding, a 90% double vaccination rate. And Australians, and particularly Western Australians, are starting to say, what else do we have to do? And what more is there that we can do? And what they are now starting to say is that government requirement to say you have to, as a business, check people whether or not they've been vaccinated, are saying now, government, with the greatest of respect, it's becoming a bridge too far. And I understand the argument, and I'll tell you why. We all accept legislation that gives the executive arm of government, in this case the Commissioner of Police, extraordinary powers for such a limited period. But what we don't accept is when the Commissioner of Police can continue to make copious numbers of directions, as he does, almost on a monthly basis, directing ever increasing requirements of people not only to comply with the directions issued, but telling people who can go into certain spots, when and under what circumstances. Now, I watched a video last night that was online, and it was a guy who had been checked in his business to ask whether or not he was wearing a mask. The situation descended very quickly into him not giving his name and address, saying that he had an exemption to wear a mask, not giving his name and address to the police officers, and then the police officers arresting him under the identification of people, or the legislation which is relevant to a police officer suspecting that he is committing an offence, and then arresting him to check his details, no doubt then finding out who he truly is afterwards, and perhaps even charging him for failing to disclose his name and address. And the very real sense amongst most Australians is that we don't want to be impacted in our daily life to that extent. We are prepared to accept that there is reasonable and necessary requirements to curtail COVID-19. We are prepared to work under the Emergency Management Act, but I get the very real sense that businesses are now saying it's too much to say to each one of us that we have to collect data on whether or not people, and permit entry on the basis of whether or not a person has been properly vaccinated. It is entirely possible that the government will mandate individuals, and they already have, in fact, mandated certain people to be marshals. That is, people to go around to check compliance. Now, this is very troubling if one were to consider that the only necessary criteria is that they undertake a course online, and in addition to undertaking a course online, they have a National Police Clearance Certificate. But beyond that, there is very little that a marshal is required to do by way of the necessary insurance that they are a person who is properly able and properly to be trusted by us as a community with the sorts of powers that are intended to be given to them, not by legislation, but again, by directions. Now, the questions that I've been asked is, to what extent are these sorts of powers able to be challenged? Firstly, powers which are issued, which exceed the ability to give those directions, are able to be challenged out of a Supreme Court by way of judicial review through one of the prerogative writs if we see that the responsibility, or rather the power that has been given, has been exceeded. Now, this is where it gets very difficult. The government has, through legislation, enabled certain emergency powers to be issued and directions to be issued. But when an emergency extends beyond the 3-day period contained within the Act, one starts to question to what extent ought there to be directions which are beyond the power, or rather beyond the review of the Parliament of Western Australia, to which we all elect individuals. To what extent are we prepared to continue to allow the executive arm of government to dictate by a set of directions all and every aspect of our life, including checking whether or not somebody has been properly vaccinated prior to their entry into our business, under threat that if we do not do so, we in fact could be subject to a fine? To what extent are we all prepared to allow this sort of incursion on other people's liberty and demand that we as a business are required to adopt these COVID safety plans, which have as a requirement that we will adhere to the directions and that we will check people, and we have to identify the steps that we take to check people entering into our business. The very real sense of Australians is to say enough is enough. We are now joining together as groups of business, as you were doing in Mandurah, and are starting to say this is not acceptable because it exceeds that contained in the legislation. Now, there is a case to be made to say that it does, that these directions do exceed the requirements of the Emergency Management Powers Act. However, one needs to determine whether or not within Western Australia a court would be prepared to accept that powers and directions issued under legislation exceed that which is properly the purview of the executive arm of government. And that's where it's a lot more difficult, because in Western Australia, at the very least, there has not been a general acceptance, and in fact in the whole of Australia, there has not been a general acceptance of persons claiming liberty under the Constitution or certain rights and freedoms that in other countries they have come to expect and accept. For example, under a Bill of Rights. We don't have a Bill of Rights, or under the Constitution. There's no powers, there's no liberties in effect apart from those which are implied into the Constitution. So there is no other constraint on the powers, at least not of the state government. And it's for that reason that it is for the state members of Parliament to question the extent to which government ought to continue to make directions or enable directions to be issued by the executive arm of government without those directions being reviewed by the parliamentary arm of government. In this state, at the very least, we have a very limited number of people who are able to work against the government, or not even work against the government, hold the government to account in relation to the way within which the government is interpreting and applying its powers. And it's for that reason that my view is that it is for the state government to properly consider whether or not they are and ought to continue to allow the executive arm of government to pass these types of directions. I do not recommend at this point that you would consider a Supreme Court challenge. Not because I don't believe that that the power is being exceeded, but because you need to demonstrate forcefully, clearly, and without doubt that the power to issue directions under the Emergency Management Act is being breached. And although I don't like the fact that an emergency has gone on for close to 2 years, when the Emergency Management Act was only ever intended to last for declared state of emergency was only ever intended to last for 3 days, there is not a lot that is in effect able to be done about it. I do encourage you, however, to use your political might, your political pressure. I do encourage you to meet together, to work together, to raise with your local Member of Parliament and to start to raise issues. I do not, however, recommend civil disobedience. It is not, in my view, an appropriate response. But you must write letters, draft petitions, and with the assistance of both Andrew and Matt, have those petitions lodged before each or both Houses of Parliament in Western Australia. At least there's two opposition members in the lower house, and there are still a number of opposition members in the upper house. it ought to be something that is done with some degree of diligence and done properly, because there are strict rules in respect of laying a petition before the Houses of Parliament, and you need to ensure that you comply with those requirements. Now, on to the question of whether or not you ought to join together to form an association. I am of the view that what you've got in Mandurah at the present time is a special bond between businesses who recognise a problem. You have joined together so far in a loosely affiliated group. You need to have 5 persons in order to be able to afford for yourself the protection of the Associations and Corporations Act. And my view is you should join together, pass the simple constitution to incorporate yourselves as a new association. The process of doing so is fairly simple. You should select at least 5 persons to be your core or be your members or your office bearers, and those are going to be the key people who are going to run your organisation, your management committee. Then you should prescribe the number of people or who is able to join, and then you really ought collectively to consider whether or not you want to take out advertisements, whether or not you want to place petitions before the Parliament, whether or not you want to go en masse and knock on the door of your local member, I think in Mandurah, Mr. Templeman, and whether or not you wish to motivate and assist other people to drive home to government that whereas you're obliged and obligated by law to collect the data and information that they're imposing upon you, it is not something that you are doing willingly. There is a limit to the goodwill of the Australian people. The Australian people will eventually stand up and say, enough is enough. And I am hearing loud and clear that that is precisely what you are doing in Mandurah by this group that you're now forming together. I encourage you to form an association. I will assist you pro bono to register that association and adopt a constitution if you so wish. I encourage you to use the funds that you might otherwise wish to use to challenge the legislation, which incidentally I don't think will ultimately be successful. I encourage you to use those funds to take out advertisements. I encourage you to support persons who have clarity of mind in respect of the responses that ought to be given to government using emergency powers to continually pass directions without it being the subject of the scrutiny of the Western Australian Parliament. And I commend you all on being prepared to work collectively in order to say enough is enough. I'm Tim Howling. I'm sorry I couldn't join you today. I'm in a trial. I would be pleased to take telephone calls but directed to me through Andrew or Matt, who are there today to assist, to focus the discussion and to consider the best way of moving forward. Thanks for involving me. I love the Peel region. I've had a long association with many businesses in the Peel region and a long association with what is the Forest Highway, having fought for so many of the landowners along the Forest Highway for their rightful compensation. I do wish you well, and I am encouraging you very much to stay in close contact together with Matt and Andrew, form an association, channel your funds through there. If there's an overstepping of the line eventually, I'd be pleased to assist you further to consider at what stage we will take such action as is necessary by way of legal action. Okay, thanks for inviting me along, and all the very best.